Bobby Fischer's greatest chess rival, probably not Boris Spassky, who he beat for the world championship, but was in fact American Samuel Reshevsky. Reshevsky was a child prodigy just like Fischer. In fact, he became a prodigy at a much younger age, and they battled against each other in many U.S. championships and many games to determine who was the stronger player, who was the best in the United States. As we know, of course, Fischer ended up winning that battle, but Reshevsky was not far behind. He was a real chess genius. This game was played in 1962 at the U.S. Championship, and Fischer uses a strategy that's actually become modern, is common in modern chess, and a very clear strategy that any of us can implement in our own games. He has the white pieces, Reshevsky has black. Let us jump right in. E4 from Fischer, C5, the Sicilian defense from Reshevsky, knight to F3. We have an open Sicilian on the board, knight F6, knight C3, and A6. Reshevsky plays the Najdorf Sicilian, one of the best defenses in chess, and Bobby Fischer's favorite defense against E4. And here Fischer plays H3, which was a little strange at that time. It's, as I said, more popular nowadays. The idea is to play G4 and gain space on the king side and maybe use those pawns for an attack. Reshevsky plays G6, preparing to find Keto on the king side. And this works pretty well against this formation, sort of slowing it down a little bit, because usually you don't want to use this H-pawn as a hook against the G-pawn, but it's already moved one time, and so you don't want to move it twice in that case. G4, Fischer continues, bishop to G7, and here the main move is bishop to G2 to accentuate the control over D5, but instead Fischer plays G5, hitting the knight at F6 and attempting to dislodge it. Knight to H5, I mean, he did dislodge it, it has to move, and bishop to E2, threatening to chop off that knight and wreck Black's kingside pawn structure. And Reshevsky comes up with a neat little maneuver to keep that from happening. He plays the move E5, which directly attacks the knight at D4, and when the knight moves, now knight to F4. The pawn at E5 helps support the knight on F4. Now, Black's knight is well placed, but he does have some other problems. He does have some light squared weaknesses, particularly D5, and he has blocked that nice bishop at G7 for the time being. But the knight at F4 is a nice piece, and if Fischer takes it, he would just open up this nice long diagonal for Black. So that's a little tricky. But he wants the knight off the board. So how does Fischer get that knight off? Well, he plays knight to D5. That D5 square is always sensitive in these structures, so this knight challenges the knight at F4. Black cannot take on G5 because the knight to C7 check would fork the king and the rook. So the knight really needs to come off. Knight takes knight, queen takes knight. He doesn't take with the pawn. He doesn't want to block that hold. He wants to keep that D5 square weak as long as he can. So he takes with a piece. Knight to C6 with the threat of bishop to E6. Now, that looks like a pretty good move for Black. Black is threatening bishop to E6. The queen could move. He can play D5, eliminating his weakness, and all is well with the world. But Fischer, seeing this, stops it immediately with his next move. Bishop to G4, challenging that light squared bishop and making it very hard, making it impossible really to play bishop to E6. So now the bishops come off, bishop G4, HG4. And yes, Fischer has double pawns, but they control a lot of key squares, and now he has a half-open H-file where he can put pressure on that H7 pawn, and that pressure stays there for a very, very long time and will eventually bear fruit. Reshevsky plays queen to C8, a very sneaky move. He's threatening to just take the pawn at G4. He's also threatening knight to B4, where the queen and the knight would threaten C2, and the knight would gain a tempo on the queen at D5. So how does Fischer stop these two threats of queen to G4 and knight to B4? Simple enough. Queen to D1. Defending G4, it will no longer lose a tempo to the knight, and defending C2. All's right with the world. Knight to D4 from Reshevsky. Now, he knows Fischer's not going to let him take on C2, but he understands that this weak square on D5 is best exploited by a knight. So by playing the knight to D4, he's basically wanting to take off Fischer's knight, so he'll never be able to put a knight on this square. So after C3, kicking the knight at D4, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight. So Reshevsky has at least succeeded in doing that. That is, keeping a knight out of the D5 square. But if we look at the position Fischer is better. Mainly, compare these minor pieces. Fischer has a good bishop versus a bad bishop, completely blocked by its own pawn. He has a weak light square at d5 he can exploit, and a little bit more space. And for someone like Fischer, he doesn't need a lot more. He also has this nice half-open h-file he can work on. Queen to e6 from Reshevsky, again trying to keep some control over d5. Rook to a5. Notice there's a lot of focus on that square. The rook goes here to accentuate Fischer's control. f6. And here Fischer makes an interesting decision to go into an endgame, feeling that with his better bishop, he would be better off. He plays queen to d5, offering the exchange of queens, and queen to g4 would be a blunder because Fischer could take on b7 with a double attack, hitting the rook at a8 and the bishop at g7. So black cannot do that. So queens do come off, again taking on d5 with a piece and not a pawn, trying to leave that weakness there. King to d7, taking on f6, bishop f6, and now g5. Does a couple of things. It hits this bishop at f6, the bishop at c1 defends the pawn, and it also keeps this pawn at h7 backwards. And that's an uncomfortable thing for black as this game continues. Reshevsky plays bishop to e7, defending the pawn at d6, king to e2, rook a to f8, putting pressure on this half-open file, trying to maybe get some counterplay. Bishop to e3, rook to c8, b4, b5. So I think Reshevsky's idea is to play rook to c6 and defend the a6 pawn laterally. But that could be troublesome. Rook d to d1. What Fischer's going to do is attack a6 and h7 at the same time, shifting his rooks back and forth until Reshevsky can only defend one of the pawns and not defend the other. Really powerful from Fischer. King to e6, rook to a1, right? He attacks a6, has to be defended. Rook to c6 defends it. But now rook to h3 from Fischer, threatening to double on the h-file and win the h7 pawn. Black defends by playing bishop to f8 so that the bishop would not block this rank, and he could play the rook to c7 to help defend the h7 pawn. Rook a to h1 and rook to c7. But you'll notice with this maneuver, Fischer is causing Reshevsky's pieces to become a little bit less coordinated each time he threatens something. Now, looking at the position, it's very hard for black to find a move at all here. So Fischer just plays rook to h4, basically a tempo move, trying to tell black, okay, play something. You know, you don't have many good options. Play a move here. And Reshevsky plays d5. After rook to f7, Fischer would just play rook to a1, and now the a6 pawn would fall. The rook cannot defend from a7 because the bishop at e3 controls that square. So Reshevsky plays d5, breaking in the center. Fischer doesn't have to take the pawn, and he doesn't. Rook to a1, again attacking a6. Rook to c6, ed5 check, king d5, and he uses that maneuver to bring the rook back to d1 to control the d-file and make his rook active to the maximum. King to e6, now rook to d8. Putting pressure here. If bishop to g7, then rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, rook takes h7. He would win the pawn at h7, so black cannot play bishop to g7. If he plays rook to d6, seeking a trade of rooks, Fischer would just ignore it, might check once, and then after rook to a8, he would be hitting a6 as well as this, having the pressure on the back rank that he currently has. So after rook to d8, black plays king to f5, and rook to a8, just as we were saying. This rook is at its maximum position, controlling the back rank and keeping constant pressure on this a6 pawn. The rook goes to e6, and here Fischer plays a little trick, a little tactic that Reshevsky does not fall for, but it does cause him real problems. He plays rook to h3. It doesn't look like much, but in fact, Fischer is threatening to play rook takes f8, check, take that bishop, then when rook takes rook, rook to f3, forcing the king, and he'd win a whole bishop in that case. So Reshevsky, in order to deal with that, really having no choice, eventually he has to deal with all of these threats. He goes ahead and decides to give up the h7 pawn. He plays that move, bishop g7, rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, rook takes h7. Fischer finally gets his pawn, And he still has a lot of the advantages that he already had. He's still up a pawn himself, and he still has a target on a6 and maybe at some point even g6. Rook comes back to e8 to defend the bishop. Rook to f7 check. And now king to g4. But this allows Fischer to cut off the king from the action. f3, king to g3. And this king looks like it's deep in white's territory, but actually it's away from the real theater of action in the center and on the queen side, and it gets locked on the side of the board. So it's not that good a place for the king. King to d3 from Fischer. He loved, of course, to come into the e4 square. Reshevsky plays a good practical move to try to survive. He plays e4 check, giving up a second pawn, but freeing up his dark squared bishop. Maybe he can find some activity that way. Pawn takes, rook to d8 check, and now bishop to d4. Fischer would welcome an exchange of bishops. This rook endgame is easily winning for him. King to g4, threatening pawn. Then rook to f1. And here bishop to e5 is played, trying to take advantage of this pin. King to e3, bishop to c7, rook to g1 check. Now this forces Reshevsky's king to the side of the board completely. King to h4, king to f3, rook to d7, and e5. The passed pawn begins to march, and it's very difficult for Reshevsky to do anything about it, particularly with this king cut off. Rook to f7 check, king to e4. The rook comes into f5, threatening to grab on g5, but this pawn is really too fast. e6 is played. If he does take on g5, then the rooks come off, and e7, and the pawn cannot be stopped from queening. So Reshevsky plays the bishop to d8 to help control that e7 square. But now bishop to f6 from Fischer. Controlling e7 and threatening to just play e7 and advance the pawn. So Reshevsky takes on f6, gf6, rook f6, and he doesn't just advance the pawn here, because then Reshevsky could play rook to e6 check and win the pawn. As it turns out, in this position, white is still winning because of the position of black's king after rook to g6. He would still be winning, but why complicate matters? Keep that pawn. So king to d5, defends the pawn, rook to f2, threatening to get behind the pawn to try to slow it down, but then rook to e1 from Fischer, and in this position, Reshevsky resigned as he can't stop the pawn. He could play rook to f8, e7, rook to e8, king to d6, and after king to d7, that would be it. So Fischer played a pretty simple system against the Sicilian, against the Najdorf. We see it today. Attack on the king side, but he used that to create positional strength, to control those light squares, get a better bishop, and use those rooks to defeat his opponent. I hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.